Hey minions, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and on this episode of King of the Hill, I want to talk about the Lord of the Ditch, the Dwarf King. For the month of September, I'll be showcasing the Munchkin expansion because I don't think it gets enough attention. This will mean talking about some factions I don't actually like, and Dwarves is one of those factions. Let me state up front that I am not a Dwarf expert, and I'm sure there are more experienced Munchkin players out there, but it's important for me to address both the strengths of the Dwarves as well as the reasons many players ignore Munchkin. I'm leading with them to close the loop on something I said last week about rule changes I know are coming. The Dwarf King has the ongoing ability, when a treasure card on one of your minions goes to the discard pile, place it into your hand instead. However, if you read the big crazy rulebook carefully, you'll notice a statement on page 7 under the Monsters and Treasures section. When a monster or treasure card leaves play, it always goes to the corresponding discard pile, regardless of card text to the contrary. This took me by surprise, as it completely invalidated the Dwarf King's ability. Normally, card text trumps rules, but when rules explicitly say regardless of card text to the contrary, the rule wins. Unfortunately, I noticed this too late as the file was already sent off to the printer. That was back in March. This is now September, and it was a lesson for me in how well in advance board game deadlines must be met. Despite all this, the advice that I've been given is that it is an obvious mistake and to remove treasures from that sentence. It only applies to monsters. If you play with Munchkin, consider this an unofficially official errata until the rulebook is updated. But ignoring that text, what do we do with the Dwarf King's ability? There are some king minions that are hard to feature without this turning into a how-to guide for the faction, and the Dwarf King might be one of the hardest. This is because of the fairly self-contained nature of their faction. In fact, every single one of their cards mentions the word treasure. While the dwarves do excel at getting themselves treasure cards, their dependency on it makes it hard to find a natural partner. The treasures themselves aren't doing the dwarves any favors. So for all intents and purposes, this is going to be my how-to guide for dwarves without going too much into partners, and by partners, I mean thieves. Dwarf King reminds me very much of Clyde 2.0. All of the confusion around Clyde 2.0 extends here as well. Yes, if Clyde 2 is on a scoring base, you get the actions back, because otherwise, you would rarely get them back. Dwarf King trades up for a global benefit, not requiring him to be on any particular base, but at the cost of only getting treasures placed on your minions, of which there are 10 of 22 treasures overall. To understand the Dwarf King, you need to understand both the treasure deck and his underlings. If you've ever played a Final Fantasy game, you might get the reference when I say that treasures remind me of blue magic. There's some good stuff in there, but most of it is ordinary and time-consuming to collect. In the context of Smash Up, many of these cards are comparable to other cards, and the fact that they are treasures as opposed to general actions doesn't have much meaning outside of cards like Dwarf King. Chainsaw of Bloody Dismemberment is an upgrade. Buckler of Swashing is shell game. For the treasures that are actually unique and good, it's imperative that you actively keep them for the long haul, and this is where the Dwarf King comes in. There are two endgames for the dwarves with respect to treasure, and the Dwarf King is part of both of them. The first is to prolong your possession of your treasure cards. In the context of dwarves alone, the problem I have is that while they draw a lot of treasure cards, you're never fully guaranteed to get what you want, and many of their cards are fraught with risk. The dwarves mitigate this by putting treasures into the discard pile where only they can interact with them, giving them more insight than a blind draw. This is where the Gold Digger is important. The Gold Digger is your best way of getting the treasures you want the Dwarf King to persist. As I mentioned before, there are 10 treasures, roughly 50% of the deck, that can be played on a minion. Of those, the ones that stand out are the Potion of Redundancy Potion and the Jetpack of Anachronism. The Potion of Cowardice is not something you want on you, although the Dwarf King would pick it up after another player is done with it, because his ability doesn't indicate that you need to control the treasure card, only that it is on your minion. As a global ability, you'll want Dwarf King to camp out on a base that won't score for a while so as to maximize his ability. But the second endgame is much more straightforward, albeit difficult to pull off in my opinion. Treasures are a source of power for the gem grabbers and the loot lover. As you power up your gem grabbers or other minions, you'll want to retrieve those treasures so that they can be replayed onto your loot lovers for maximum power. The Dwarf King helps with the recycling, but the dwarves only have one card that helps with playing those treasures for a big drop, and that's Cash Out. If done properly, the Dwarf King facilitates a 10 power drop from the loot lover and 3 treasures, plus any power boosts from your treasures. Hopefully, these are ones that also boost power, such as Boots of Butt Kicking that can allow a 4th treasure to be played. That sounds like a pretty good combo, and I always enjoy clearly defined endgames. So why don't I like dwarves? It's largely driven by my distaste for treasures, but the lack of natural partners really hurts the Dwarf King. Thieves are a natural fit, but I'll cover that in an eventual Thieves video, not going to be this month however. With the Dwarf King, who gives back many treasures, you need a faction that can play a lot of actions or benefit from having actions on them. The Wizard and Cyborg Apes come to mind, but I just have a hard time with this because Wizard Cyborg Apes are amazing, whereas the Dwarf combos struggle a little bit. You already have Clyde 2.0, who does most of what the Dwarf King does, and Cyberback negates the need to have your actions in your hand. While having the extra play on minions cards is nice, I'd rather have the Cyborg Ape actions than treasures. Don't misunderstand, there's still a fit there, but I think it's a case of Cyborg Apes doing the heavy lifting and dwarves playing the role of support. Like a blue mage, only with much less control over what you are getting. Additionally, if you did build up a powerful loot lover, you could just as easily persist the minion to another base, and the Dwarf King would become much less relevant. If I'm truly being honest about treasures, I think the standard actions are much more interesting, as there are 4 specials that can be played as a base scores, and some of them are quite powerful. Unfortunately, the Dwarf King doesn't do anything with these types of cards. In fact, if you get a bad draw and don't have access to many of your dwarf actions, your dwarf minions are pretty useless without Munchkin bases, and a card like Dwarf King, designed to camp out on a base, either stays in your hand or stays out in play doing little to nothing. This is the same problem Innsmouth suffers when they have locals in hand but no means to play them as extra cards. Another way to get treasures is through the defeat of monsters, or when a Munchkin base scores, but at this point Smash Up is pretty unrecognizable, and this is a point I'll cover when I talk more in depth about monsters and treasures. Munchkin has some great factions, some of which are truly unique. Dwarves are definitely unique, but their uniqueness hurts them in my opinion. Nevertheless, they have a clearly defined endgame, and the Dwarf King facilitates that. But the inevitable comparison to Clyde 2.0 didn't give me a good first impression of the dwarves, and when combined with the inclusion of treasures, this is a Munchkin only or bust faction for me. For a while, I've been meaning to experiment with this faction as a self-contained, only faction in the game with access to treasures mechanic, but I just haven't felt a compelling reason to spend the time to do that. Time is one of my most valued treasures. Oh well, can't like every faction I suppose. What do you think about the Dwarf King and the treasures mechanic? Let me know in the comments. That's it for this week. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.